Van's wailing this morning, huh? Yeah. Hey, good morning. Welcome to the garden. I'm glad you're here with us on this first Sunday of summer. A while back, I was talking to a friend who was sharing about someone she knew who had been in a class with her and had become what she described as stuck. She said that she was kind of stuck in her faith, and in the course of this class, she didn't seem to move anywhere, and that she'd just run into her after a year or two, and she was still in the same place where she was. And so we got into talking about what we do with situations like that. How can we help people get unstuck and keep growing in their faith journey? So that whole episode was very much on my mind when I started to do my study and research in preparation for today. Now, the theme that had been set for today was something along the lines of, "Your God is too small." And when I looked at that, I immediately thought of an old book, and I do mean old, something I read long before seminary, before I ever thought of entering ministry. It was a book by J.B. Phillips that's called "Your God is Too Small," by that very name. And so I looked on my shelves and couldn't find it, and I'm sure it was yellowed copy by now if I had found it. And so I downloaded it on my Kindle and reread it. And I found it to be exactly on target with what my friend and I had been talking about. So much so that I even emailed her and suggested that if she hadn't read that book, she might want to. And that if she had read it, she might want to reread it. Because it seemed to me that part of what Phillips is saying in the book is that we get stuck sometimes because of our misperceptions of who God is and what God is like. And sometimes the way we view God, the images we have of God, may in fact damage us or derail us from our faith journey. And it's not only that, it's not only these images we have, it's how we hear people convey such images. For example, sometimes we hear people say, "God loved your child so much that God took him or her." Or, "It was God's will that this accident happened." Or, "This tornado or flood or earthquake or whatever it was God's will that this is punishing somebody for something they've said or done or what they're like." And to that, all I can say is nonsense. That is pure and utter nonsense. That isn't at all, at least in my experience, as to who God is or what God is like. And yet, as human beings, we're all limited. And we can't even begin to understand the magnitude and the height and depth and limitlessness of who God is. And yet we very often try to. In fact, in the Bible passage this morning, it says that God made us in God's image. But I think very often we do exactly the opposite. We make God in our image. And sometimes that really gives us a misperception, a misunderstanding of who God is and what God is like. It's like the child, I know you've heard this story about the child who was drawing a picture, and the teacher, doing all the right things, said, "That's a very interesting picture. Tell me about it." And the child said, "I'm drawing a picture of God." The teacher responded, "Well, no one knows what God looks like." And the child said, "They will when I get done." So don't we do that sometimes? Don't we paint our own picture of God so that we have this understanding that we think can be shared and become universal? And we also hear things, particularly when we're children, that can have an effect on us that is far beyond what we might ever imagine. I read about a guy who became a leader in the Roman Catholic Church of England, and he talked about something that happened when he was a child. Apparently, he was always tempted to raid the cookie jar in the kitchen. And he said inevitably his mom caught him when he was doing that. And when she did, in her sternest voice, she said to him, "God is going to get you for that." It worries me somehow that he became a leader in the church, because I really hope he didn't pass that on to very many others. But the thing that really affects me about that is I think it's sad. I think it's really sad that somehow we have this image of a God who's angry and harsh and judgmental and condemning, and that God is just standing there waiting for us to do something wrong and then is going to zap us and we'll be done. And that just doesn't fit my experience of who God is and what God is like. If it were, there's no way I'd be standing here with you today trying to talk about this very thing. So I want us to kind of explore this whole concept. As I thought about my conversation with that friend I mentioned at the beginning, it occurred to me that some of us may have some understandings of God and have this image of God that may be in one way or another inadequate. It may not be well serving us at this particular point in our life journey. So I'd like for us to think a little bit and to explore a little bit about what our images of God are and how we might need to maybe let go of some of those or re-image that whole idea. Now, a good place to start is probably with that book I mentioned by J.B. Phillips entitled Your God is Too Small. And in that book, one of the things he says is that when we are children, that is the beginning of our image of God being formed. And very often, our images when we're children are very childlike and natural. And yet what happens is we never let go of those, and then eventually they become childish and immature, and they don't really fit the life situations that we encounter. Furthermore, there are experiences that happen to us that really can cause some damage and some harm to our understandings of God and therefore our faith journey. In fact, I remember when I was in seminary, I had to do what was called clinical pastoral education, which is a year-long process where you work in a hospital or whatever to be in training to deal with all these situations. And I was at LaRue Carter Hospital, which at that time was a very active place for those who were mentally ill. And I recall a psychiatrist who came to our session one day, and we were all pastors in training, and said to us, if it weren't for folks like you, this place would be empty. Now, he wasn't pointing us out individually. By that, he meant pastors and churches, that if it weren't for folks like us in those places, there would be very little mental illness. Now, I don't know whether he was right or not, but all I can say to you is that remark has really stuck with me all this time. And so I thought maybe this morning we ought to think about some of those images that may be inadequate, that may not fit anymore, that perhaps for ourselves we might be willing to let go of and then to come to some new understandings. And so I'd like to use J.B. Phillips' book and talk a little bit about that. Now, in his book, he has 12 different, what he considers to be misunderstandings of who God is and what God is like. Don't worry, I'm not going to go through all 12. But I thought I would share those that I seem to have encountered the most in my ministry, along with a couple of others that he doesn't name, at least he doesn't name specifically. And I hope that as I think about these, maybe we'll consider for ourselves where we are on this, kind of what our image of God is, and see if it fits in any of these boxes that at least Phillips considers to be inadequate. The very first one he talks about is what he calls parental hangover. And he says basically what I shared with you before, that as children we get our impression of who God is and what God is like primarily from our parents. And we take what we learned from our parents and begin to apply that to God. If, for example, we have a parent who is critical or domineering or authoritarian in any way, then we may in fact see God that way. And we may cower in fear, or we may constantly find ourselves feeling guilty. So that's one of the understandings Phillips has. The next one he has is what he calls the grand old man. You've already heard a little bit of that in the video, where God is imaged as an old man with gray hair, a long beard, flowing robes in heaven. Now, if you've been around here a while, you know that I'm going to push against part of that to begin with, because the whole thought that God is male just simply doesn't fit. That's not appropriate. The only reason we use masculine pronouns all too often to talk about God is because of the limits of our language. It really has nothing to do in terms of representing a gender of who God is and what God is like. In fact, that's really what our Bible passage for today says. Now, this is the first creation story in the book of Genesis. I'm reading the version that comes from the Message, and let's look at it and think about it. God spoke, Let us make human beings in our image, make them reflecting our nature. God created human beings and created them godlike, reflecting God's nature. God created them male and female. Now think about that. Did you hear what it said? God made human beings and created them godlike, reflecting God's nature. God made them male and female. What that says to me is whenever I encounter any one of you, I'm encountering God and the face of God. We see God there. And think about the incredible diversity of humanity. That's God. And that's the kind of diversity that God represents. It's something far greater than anything we can typically imagine. So I think that God as the grand old man is maybe something that we might want to rethink as well. There's another one that Phillips talks about, is what he calls the heavenly bosom. And again, this is something that gets formed often in childhood, where we're told that nothing will happen to us, God will protect us, God will take care of us, we'll always be okay. And if we keep carrying that through life, we may find out that life doesn't work that way, that things happen in the course of life. We do sometimes have bad things that occur to us, and we don't have a life that is smooth sailing and flawless. It just simply doesn't work that way. And to think that way, to understand that way, doesn't equip us very well to live in the world in which we find ourselves. Then there's something else he talks about, and he calls it a God in a box. And I think what Phillips is talking about when he does that is he's really talking about what the church has done over the centuries to box God in and insist on a certain view of who God is and what God is like. And partly that's because the church thinks it's the authority and the only voice that has anything to say about God. And that if that's the case, then all we have to do is jump through the church's hoops and nod our heads in agreement with these beliefs that are set forth for us and sign on the dotted line, and voila, we know God. It's all said and done. Woe into any of those who would bring questions about scientific discoveries or psychological understandings that might change some of the things that we think or believe, because they just simply don't fit in that God box. There's yet another one that Phillips talks about, and he calls it a managing director. And by that, he simply means that God created the universe in all of its vastness, and that was it. God doesn't care anything at all about any of us. God doesn't have anything to do with any of us. And that can lead to some different kinds of feelings of abandonment, of depression, of frustration, of feeling insignificant and unimportant. And it can also lead us to think, well, why bother to do anything? We can be absolved of any responsibility in dealing with any of the issues that we face in life, in facing those and trying to change some of the wrongs that need righting. Now, he calls it a managing director. I think of something that's similar but a little bit different, what I've always called the clockmaker God. And that's the sense that God put everything in motion, started the world, and then kind of stepped back and just kind of watches it work. And in that regard, God is present, but very distant and more remote. And it seems as though it's impossible for us to have a very close and deep relationship with who God is and what God is like. There's yet one more image that we sometimes see. It's what I would refer to as a Santa Claus God, or the cosmic bellboy God, and that's the sense that we just ring the bell and share our wish, and our wish is God's command, that whatever we want to happen is going to happen. And we get into this sometimes when we think about our prayers, that all we have to do is ask, and exactly what we ask is going to come true. And you know, and I know, that it doesn't work that way very often. And so that sometimes can be an inadequate understanding of God, and something that doesn't really help us cope with the world as we find it. Well, those are just some of the images there. I know there are many, many others. And I hope as we've talked about them this morning, maybe we've had a chance, each of us, to think about our own understandings of God. If we went into that God in the box and were asked about our image of God, what would we say? And how does it seem to us? Is it adequate? Does it work for us today? Or are we somehow kidding ourselves? I guess I'd like us to think about that in the next week as maybe our own personal mission, and to come back and then for us to think together about other ways that we might understand God. I'm going to share where I am, as inadequate as it is, and hopefully maybe we will come to some fresh insights and some fresh understandings. So just let me ask, are you willing?